first put this coupling together. That little guide bush goes on first, and here's the gear. Put a touch of synthetic grease on the inside, some on the outside, you know, a touch on the front. That'll do. Fits over that shaft, drops down into there. And here is the shroud or the cover. Put that into place. Now there are two screws, chrome plated brass, quite soft and easily damaged. I was to fish that one out from where it just fell. If you've made a mess of one of these screws with your screwdriver, or if somebody else has done that, fit it in this position. That can't be seen once the camera's in use. Make sure the good screw goes to this position here. Recover that screw that had dropped down in here. There it is. Yes, the screw in this position is quite obvious. If that's damaged, it'll look damaged. You'll see it. Get those both in position. Nip those screws up. They're chrome plated brass. They're quite small. Don't break them. At the top here where that guide bush, that pin for the rangefinder sits, I'm just applying a little bit of synthetic grease there. Not as much as that. Clear some of that excess away. It's better. So that that moves smoothly in the track. As the front of the camera collapses, you'll see that that arm runs away down in that slot. That's so that that rangefinder coupling can fold away neatly. If it was just a rigid connection, when you collapse the front of the camera, it would have to poke out the back of the camera somewhere, which wouldn't be very convenient. Okay, that's the front of the camera dealt with, because I'm not going to put the door on immediately. We've got that spacer washer that goes on the shutter release, and it goes on the shaft right there. It's difficult to get that down in position if you've got the door and everything in the way, so we'll put that in later. Film advance next. I'll get this film advance together, I think. So, start here. Here's the take-up spool. One end's got a slot in it, the other end's just a round hole. Metal bush goes into the round hole. Open the back of the camera, put that into place. Here's the film advance shaft. I'm going to lubricate this with some graphite grease. You could lubricate this with anything else that suited you. I like graphite grease for this job. What I want to do is ensure that I get grease between the bush and the shaft. It's useful to have a grease that's got a little bit of tackiness to it there that tends to stay where it's put. This is some new graphite grease to me. I'm still investigating its properties. I may decide it's just the thing, or I may stop using it. It seems to work nicely. So drop this into the take-up spool. Make sure that it's seated correctly. It's jamming here now. That means that that spring on that shaft is probably not seated correctly in its slot here. That's better now. Okay. The position of this shaft. Well, there's a slot in it. Now by convention, that slot in the shaft goes to the end of the camera. Does it make any practical difference? No, not really. So you could position that bush any of three ways. The holes are equidistant. And so because you could position the shaft in any of three positions, you could say that you had three available adjustment positions for that shaft in terms of its return spring. Since the top of the shaft has a square on it, and you can put your cam in any of the four positions, you could just as easily say you have four positions of adjustment available at the top. If you take the two together, there's 12 positions. Does that make any difference? No. I usually just put that in there, put the slot towards the end of the body, just because that's conventionally where it is, tighten my 3 screws, move on. Let's carry on with this. As I've previously mentioned, today seems to be my interruptions day. I'm not getting very far at all. I'll just hang a pair of tweezers in that piece of leather so that it's not folding back over the camera and getting in my way. Right, so here I want to put the catch for the rewind button in place. That is here. I'm going to give that a wipe of molybdenum paste along the end, the rounded end. I put a wipe through the centre too, just for good measure. Then we need our return spring. Pop that loosely into place there. And the screw that holds this is a shoulder screw. There's 2 shoulders round it. One that the spring can revolve around, one that the lever will revolve around. You've got to make sure that the lever is free to move, it's not trapped underneath it. And that's not moving freely, so something's not right. Yeah, that lever's not centering on the screw correctly, I think. All right. Why does that not want to centre up? Let's just check that. Is there a burr on this? Doesn't want to seat? No, it looks okay. Is the lever bent? That looks okay. One possibility is that someone has over-tightened the screw at some stage. If the screw is over-tightened, effectively the shoulder on the end of it bites into the aluminium casting, and so the screw is effectively shorter and so locks the lever in place. No, we seem to be good. Just can't have been holding my mouth right. Now the return spring I need to hook over here, so I'll just lift the tail of that spring up and over and hook it behind there. So this is now spring loaded. So far so good. Now we can put the sprocket in the sprocket shaft. Open the back of the camera. Our sprocket is here. It was trying to roll away. It's going to go in there. Our sprocket shaft is here. Now I lubricate that towards the top and towards the bottom with a bit of molybdenum, bit of synthetic grease. Usually put a touch on the top of the gears for good measure. It slides in from the top of the camera, slides through that sprocket. I'm holding my finger on it at the top. If I pull back that lever, that'll allow that end of that shaft to come through. I've got to line up the hole in the shaft there and fit the small screw that drives it. Here it is. It's much the same as the two screws that form the hinge pins for the door, except this screw is longer. The threaded portion is longer. Right, so that's in place. At the bottom of the camera, let's get that leather tied back out of the way. I want the rewind button in place. Well, the rewind button has its own return spring and a washer. So normally I take the spring, put a wipe of grease through that, take my rewind button, take its washer and screw that onto the bottom of our sprocket shaft. Check that it's free to move, that it's not sitting on top of the lever. Then I'll get my pliers and tighten that up. That seems good. Yeah, it pops out nicely and pops in nicely. Just checking that's tight. That seems to be, that thread's funny. That's better. The thread was a bit stiff running in. I don't know why that should be. But the whys and wherefores don't really make much difference as long as we get the job done. Okay. Back where we were. We in the picture? Not really. I want to close the bottom of this camera off really now. So our tripod socket is an odd shape, only goes in one way. There are 3 screws hold that in position, and most likely they'll be the screws that have got the remains of the adhesive stuck in them. These ones haven't, because they've been cleaned to death in the ultrasonic cleaner. So all of the screws look nice and clean, like they were just new. So those 3 screws can go in position. Once they're all in position, you can tighten them up. The little shield that runs around the rewind button can go in place, and that's held in place with 2 brass screws. One of which is nice and dull in colour, and the other one's a bit brighter. I'm going to tighten those up. That's the base of the camera, and I'm not gluing my leather back down yet because I want to get at my hinge pins, but I'm just fold that leather back down in place and put one of its 2 screws in position on this surround, which will have the, what this will do for me is it'll stop that leather flapping. So the leather's not flapping, the leather won't get damaged. So that's just neat and tidy, it just makes life a lot easier. At the top of the camera, I'll do the rewind and then we'll assemble the advance. So the rewind shaft, well, we've got the inner piece. Excuse me, a message I've got to deal with. I swear if I get one more interruption, I'll swing for it. I have been so busy. Doing various jobs for various people today and interrupted by phone calls every 5 seconds. Right, there's the inside piece of our rewind shaft, the outs of the bush. I'll just lubricate that with a bit of grease, synthetic grease. Just lift that tab slightly to allow that to slide on easier. That's good. That goes on the body right there. And it's held in place with 3 screws. Same size screws as held the tripod socket on the base of the camera. And the same size as will shortly hold the film advance shaft top bush in place. Film advance components, we need the clutch for a start. The clutch I'm going to lubricate with graphite grease if I can get this stuff out. Actually, this stuff is moly grease. But it's pretty good at staying where it's put. It's quite tacky. Of course, I've got it everywhere but where I want it at the moment. Let me clean up. Let's take that excess off there. That'll do nicely. Okay, so assembling the clutch. The spring goes on the centre component. The tab in the spring locates into that little notch. And then taking a pair of crimp lug pliers, I'll get the crimp lug pliers onto the top, if I can just achieve this. Crimp lug pliers onto the top to hold that little tab in, and then if I rotate this, it'll pull the spring into line. Then if I slide the other component over the top and press down, there is our clutch neatly assembled. No fighting. A bit of synthetic grease through the centre of that. And I'll drop it in on top of the film advance. Rotate it to engage it with the notch, the slot in the top of the film, the take-up spool. And then I have the top bush, the upper bush for our film advance shaft. Just applying a bit of grease there and forcing it in to one of those 2 gear sets, and the same on the other one. Let's put a nice blob there, squeeze down with my thumb, and that just forces it in. I wipe through the centre. Done. Put this in position. Give it a wriggle, make sure it's seated. Move the sprocket, and you can see the gear move. Move my take-up spool and you can see the other gear move. So that's all engaged. 3 screws hold that in position. Same size as was used for the tripod socket and for the film rewind shaft bush. run these 3 screws in. Now I can tighten them up. And check that everything still moves nicely. That all looks good. Start to put all the gear on the top. We have this gear that goes on the top. Let's revolve that till it engages nicely. That's all good. That couples to both of those wheels. A spacer, a little ratchet pinion, and then the screw that holds that in place has a tiny spring on it. Got to get this screw through the lever, through the spacer, lined up with the hole in the top of the body casting and screwed into place all at the same time. This is not playing the game because I haven't got the door on the camera, so it keeps tipping over. Let's just put that under there. That screw's not passing through the spacer bush. Now it is. Get it up tight and get the spring correctly placed. So that this is under tension. That looks good. Okay, let's carry on. This drive dog, I'll just pop that into position. I gave that a very light wipe of grease. Here's the spring that holds that down. It's a conical spring. Large size down, large side down, small side up. Here's the ratchet that controls the action of the film advance lever. So I will apply a little bit of grease to the little teeth here on the underside. And the same for the teeth on the upper side. Now I know from experience that this will be a reasonable orientation for that to start off with this small square cutout pointing out towards this direction. That should give me sufficient return spring. The film advance lever should return nicely. This is not pressing down into position very well. That's better. Okay. Now, next, a wipe of molybdenum paste down here and drop the spring down for that pawl that drops in there. Now there are 2 cylindrical springs much the same. This one slightly smaller in diameter fits in that tube. Don't muddle them up, you won't like it. That sits on top. The bracket that holds everything in place will need some grease. That's this bracket here. I'll just put some grease on there and squeeze that to drive it in. Pop that into place. There are 3 screws hold that in place, 2 plain screws, one at the end, one down in here. I'll get that screw started. Here, there's a return spring needs to go on for that lever. And the return spring sits right there. The screw that holds that's got a shoulder on it for the spring to rotate around. It's important that the spring is free to rotate around that shoulder. Okay, well that's all in place. I can do those 3 screws up tight and hook that spring into place. So to do that I need to press this right down, lift that spring up over behind it, and that's it. So now this is sprung loaded. On the top here we have a gear. On top of the gear we had a spacer washer, a shim. This will not be present in all cases. Then there was another spacer. And then we're just about ready for the advance lever. So I've got to get this correctly positioned. This long notch here, well, I need to bring that right round to this point, and that's our start position. If I depress this, which is like pressing the shutter release, that'll drop down and I can put this lever on here. And I'm just checking that right now. I've pulled that round 90 degrees, which is a good rest position and enables me to get everything in position. But basically that film advance is connected up. I want to put the cocking rack in place. So I'll apply some synthetic grease to that. It's not going to need an awful lot because mating gears have already been lubricated. Slide that in here. When this gets round to the end of its stroke there and this thing popped up, I'll take it another little notch, feed in this lever, and it should pick up the gear and feed in. It has. I'm looking at where that sits. It's not in far enough. I need to come in further than that, so I'll just do the same. Depress that, hold my finger on the end of this rack, and as it comes in I can feel it click in one more tooth, and that should feed back in. Now I've gone too far. Now I'm the other way. I want to be in the middle of those 2 teeth. That will do. In the rest position, when the shutter film advance is back against that stop, you've got this much space. There's probably about 2.5mm space of that rack showing against the end there. That's good. my shutter film advance lever, I'll put that on there. Press that, swing that around 90 degrees. Okay, so that's ready to be, I can put all this back together now. That's just sitting sort of in the rest position. So I'll gather up these little pieces for my frame counter mechanism and film advance lever and put them on.